Thank you. So, this is really about educating ourselves. There's power in knowledge because participating in clinical research in a clinical trial, may just not be familiar, right, to you in any way. So by learning more about it and understanding the role you can play, it'll also help you to make decisions, right, for yourself that are right for your situation and your healthcare.
Max?
Um, I think it's also very fair to say this is an extremely
Huh?
complicated topic. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with putting your hand up and saying, I don't understand, or help me understand this more. One presentation probably isn't going to do it, but this is a starting point. And I just know, speaking for Margaret, for Bethany, all of us here at UMDF, if you ever have questions around this, send an email, call in. We're happy to talk it through, because this is going to be a process. So let's consider this a starting point, not the finishing line. All right, so let's get underway. So what is clinical research? We're really kind of start at the very high level. At the highest level, it's the study of health and illness in people, right? To learn how to prevent, diagnose, and treat illness. So it's very much differentiated from preclinical research, meaning work that's done in the lab. It might be on cell lines. It could be in animal models, right, of some kind. But as soon as you start to do the research in humans, we refer to that as clinical research. Sorry, next. Oh, yeah. Some of these could have animation, Margaret, so I apologize in advance. A lot of clicks. So human participants, and there's many elements associated with it, right? It certainly is always going to have a scientific basis to it, some kind of hypothesis, a question that's being asked. And then what kind of data can we collect to answer that question? Yeah, so, so what is a clinical trial? Yeah, I know, a little bit hard to do it. Um, we're going to focus on what are known as investigational clinical trials. So these are trials where some kind of medication, all right, some kind of drug is being tested. We're not going to talk so much about so-called observational clinical trials, because they're important too. MitoShare is an example of an observational clinical research project, because we're not testing any medicines inside of that, but we're asking questions, you're answering it, we're thinking about hypotheses, you're answering to those. Natural history studies are a form of observational clinical research. But really today we want to focus on interventional one, investigational trials. So where there's some kind of intervention that hopefully changes the progression of the disease. That could be a medication, a vaccine, a device, a procedure, but anything where there's a therapeutic component to it is more of an interventional clinical trial. Next. And of course, the most important government agency associated with this is the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, where they ultimately have both responsibility and obligation to ensure that only safe and effective therapies are available to U.S. citizens, right, to anybody taking the drugs. So they play a very large role, right, in the outcome of all this, because we may be doing research, hoping to develop therapies for a specific kind, and it looks really promising. We feel really good, but if the FDA is not convinced of it, that's blocking, right? There's no way to get that therapy to market if we can't collect the data that's going to be persuasive to the FDA. So a lot of that goes into clinical trial design. I'll talk about that.
Yeah, I get.
Okay, next. So multiple steps, right, to a clinical trial. I already kind of talked about discovery and development. Right, so this is the very early stage. So this is where you got to think of folks in white lab coats at the bench, kind of working through uh, making molecules, thinking about mechanisms, doing some testing, but not in humans, but in cell lines or DNA based or in animal models. That's sort of discovery and development. Then we move into the next step. Oh, sorry, we're going to go through these one by one. I know it's really hard to, I'm just going to put them up here in front of me so I have a better idea of what to expect for you, Margaret. So this is where we're just learning how disease affects patients, right? So if we don't understand the disease, it's really hard to develop the therapies. So this is a really early step of this. And then maybe one more click. The experiments here see how the therapy may work and interact with other parts of the body. So it's very preliminary aspect of it. That's why we think of it as the earliest stage of discovery and development. Okay, next. So then as we think about preclinical research, and if you click one more time, so this is now taking sort of the mind, the thought exercise, and translating it into working on cells and animal models. And this is what allows us to now narrow down the options. So you may start with literally millions of drug candidates just based on a certain mechanism or an idea. And now we're starting to narrow that down through preclinical research to try to identify what are known as hits and leads that eventually will move into the clinic. So preclinical research, we're not in humans yet. Next. And one more click. So now we get to clinical research. And so when a drug development company has kind of worked through this big funnel of all these drug candidates and they've done their preclinical research, and now they've identified the lead compound that they want to move into the clinic. This is when the regulatory agencies get involved, right, with the FDA. They need to file something known as an investigational new drug application, or IND. And basically, it's here's all the data we did preclinically. Here's why we think we are ready to move into a clinical trial. Here's the target population that we want to test. And here are the outcome measures, right, that we'll use to see if it's being effective or not. So then you move through the clinical research, and next slide, please. And now we're at step 4, the FDA review, right? So they approved it. You run the clinical trial. There's lots of interaction all during that. I don't want to make it sound like they drop out and only come back in at the review. But once a so-called sponsor, and that's what you call a company that is trying to advance a new drug, once the sponsor has all their data together, they've got the entire package, they make another submission to the FDA known as a new drug application. So that's the point where they've said, we had an idea, you approved us to test it in humans, we've collected the data, we think the data are persuasive that this works and it's safe, and now we're putting it into your hands, FDA, to review these data and make a decision as to whether or not to approve it. So those are the major steps. One last step then, if it's approved, is quite often, particularly in rare disease, there's something called post-market safety monitoring. So that's where the FDA says, okay, we see the data, it looks compelling, but we want you to continue to monitor this, right? Gather more data as doctors are beginning to write prescriptions. And so they'll come back and they'll review those data and ensure that it's still safe and effective, the drug that they approve. So these are the 5 major steps associated with getting a drug from idea all the way to the marketplace. Okay. So, yep, next, yeah. So in this pretty low graphic, we're going to click one by one here. Just to give you an idea, drug development is an extremely long, complex, expensive process, all right? That matter, it's the truth, whether that's a rare disease like a mitochondrial disease, or very common ones, something like a cardiovascular or hypertension for high blood pressure. But the rough average is about 12 years time from that preclinical work in the lab all the way through to FDA approval. So if you think about that, that's the company during all that time investing, right, in this drug candidate, and there's a decision at the end. Excuse me. Next click, please. And they're investing all that money, and only about 14% of the drugs that went in the front into the clinic end up being approved. So that's not a great rate. And there's lots of discussion about why that is. Like, why can't we be more rational about the drugs we're picking to put into humans? The very simple answer to that is humans are complex. And while we know a lot about biology and physiology and genetics and how things work, nothing to this point in time that we can do preclinical before you put it into humans is correlates higher than 14% with how it's going to actually perform in the humans. And that's a little bit disappointing, of course, but at the same time, this is the challenge we face right now. Now, I do think going forward into the future, you hear a lot about AI. This is a place where it could really make a difference, right? Because artificial intelligence can look for patterns, right, in patients and their symptoms and their genetics, all these, multifactorial, and find patterns that for humans, it's very hard for us to find that across large populations. So I think there's a lot of hope in drug development that this is a place where artificial intelligence can make a difference in helping to find better compounds to move into humans so that we get a higher success rate with the FDA. Next click. And as I said, it's really expensive, right, as well. Frankly, I don't know of any therapeutic that's been developed for 314 million. That must have been a really simple one, much more common. The average number you hear is around $2 billion. And I know we're all very frustrated by, the price of drugs, and that's a whole conversation outside the scope of this meeting, but there's no denying the fact that there's significant investment required before there's any indication that there's a chance to get return on that investment by actually selling the drug. One more click. And this is the challenging part. Quite often you hear a number of 7,000 rare diseases. That number, I think, continues to grow. It's probably fair to say that number may be up closer to 10,000 different rare diseases. Only about 5% have approved therapeutics. And we have to put mitochondrial disease in that 95% right now. There are some related diseases that are starting to get approvals, but for most of what we're talking about here, primary mitochondrial disease, the rare inherited disorders that UMDF supports for you and many other patients, no approved therapies. We're in that big piece, 95% no approved therapies. So a huge unmet medical need. And I know it's hard for us sometimes to get outside of our own mitochondrial disease world, but you really recognize that there are many, many people across the world that have other forms of rare diseases that also have no approved therapies. But this is the challenge we face. These are the numbers, right, where they are now. What can we do to make a difference against that? So let's talk a little bit here on the upcoming slides just about how these clinical trials work. So it kind of starts with as I stated, a hypothesis, a question. Like, I believe as a company that if we give compound X to patient Y at dose Z over this length of time, that outcome measures, there'll be improvements in their clinical representation A, B, and C. All right. So this is what they have to put together and then design a clinical trial to test this. And the proven most robust way to do that is what's called a placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial, meaning there's two arms running and some people are on the drug, some people aren't on the drug. You're going to test them both. And then a lot of times there's a crossover where then the people who had the drug are off the drug and the people on it, or vice versa. The two arms cross with each other. And this takes out the placebo effect as much as possible because it's a very real thing. We are all subject to this, and that our brains can convince us, even if you're getting a sugar pill, I'm getting better. I'm taking something. I must be getting better. And so that can cause what's called a signal, where now we ask somebody, are you feeling better? How are you doing? Oh, yes, I'm running more. I'm walking more. But that's a false signal, right? So we don't want those false signals in there. We want to know, what's the drug doing, not the other one. So that's why you design it this way. So the first phase of a clinical trial goes into healthy humans. And this is just to make sure it's safe. So a phase 1 trial really begins with a small group of patients, healthy humans that agree to take these investigational drugs and just make sure that they're safe. All right. So they're typically short duration, 1 month, 6 months would be a long one. And you're really just trying to answer the question, is this drug safe? Does it get metabolized in the body and not cause any other problems? Okay, then we move on to phase 2. And next click. And this is the first chance for us now to test not just safety, but also efficacy, or how well the drug works. And so now you have a slightly larger group of patients, and I know we have a number here, 50 to 75, but this can vary significantly. For ultra rare diseases, you may move all of this down to more like 10 to 15, but representative, just to give you some of the relative amounts. So phase 1, very small. Phase 2, still small. That might last 12 months or so. You're still making sure that safety is always a component of every clinical trial. So I say that just to reassure you that that's always the number one priority of the FDA and the doctors that are involved in these clinical trials. Is it safe? Because if it's not safe, it doesn't matter if it's effective or not. But what we're really testing here is how well is it working, right? And there's also now the starting to look at dosing, right? Do we give a small dose, or do we give a middle dose or a high dose? So they're kind of looking across different dose ranges to see where you get a therapeutic response. Next. So then we move into phase 3. And so assuming phase 2 provided some data that looks promising, all right? So you're looking at the data to say, oh, yes, I do see that the patients that received the drug improved in some way, some kind of outcome measure, 6-minute walk test, less fatigue, better cognitive results in some kind of survey, right? So some kind of objective measures are improving on those who were on the drug and not those that were in the placebo arm, right? Because we're always looking for the difference. So now you move to phase 3, where it's really a larger group, and now you're trying to make your case, right? This is the one where we're going to test it in this population, still make sure it's safe. Now we know the dose we want. We know it's working, but now we're going to prove it. And importantly, as you see here in this step, does the benefit outweigh the risk? Because very rarely is everything moving in the direction you want it, but there may be some data that emerges like, oh, a small number of patients developed headaches, right, during it. But, they also felt like they were 100% improved over where they were prior to the trial. So what risk are you willing to accept in order to get a specific benefit? So you have to do a larger trial to kind of tease this out before you take it to the FDA. And so now we have that new drug application I talked about after running the phase 3. That is submitted to the NDA, excuse me, the NDA is submitted to the FDA and they review all the data. There's a number of paths they can take. They can either reject it outright, they can approve it outright, but there's all kinds of middle ground too, where they might say, progress, we're not convinced yet. Why don't you go back and run that trial again and make this change? So now the company faces a hard decision, right? Because the expense associated with developing a drug goes up like a hockey stick as you move through the phases. Phase 1, pretty cheap. Phase 2, a little more. By phase 3, it's getting much higher, larger population, more data. So when the FDA says run another trial, that's a big question they have to ask themselves. If we invest in another trial, how much does that increase the likelihood that we'll get approval for it? So big decisions, business decisions are being made in addition to the sort of the science and the therapeutic side of it too. But if it's approved, right, phase 4, quite often, they may move on. It's listed as 3 to 12 months, but it may be ongoing. It could be for years. They decide to continue to collect data associated with it. Still want to make sure it's safe. They want to understand side effects that may pop up in a larger population that didn't appear in a phase 2 or a phase 3. And ultimately, yes, the FDA has to make a determination, is this cost effective as well? They're not, the FDA is not involved in setting the price of a drug in any way, but when it's set, they have to make some level of determination. If this is going to cost millions and millions of dollars and you're only improving them a little bit, maybe this isn't a great drug for us to have on the market. So, but these are downstream issues. And for our community, we really need to be focused on success in phases 1, 2, and 3 so that we get more drugs to the FDA. They learn more about mitochondrial disease and the patients. And then we can move on to the next frontier, which is access to the drug, pricing of drug, et cetera. So yeah, these are the major phases, and you can kind of see how the numbers of patients that are required increase across there. And that's why it's really important that we continue these kinds of educational series and actions with the patient community to make sure we have a really large funnel of patients that are willing to go through clinical trials, because we will need more and more as more and more therapies get developed. Okay, next slide. Let's see. And I'm getting close to wrapping up here. I know we have to cover other things. So there's very much a journey, right, associated with participating in a clinical trial. It begins with really taking the first step of being interested. And by being here today, you're interested. You're interested in learning about it and understanding it. That's the first step. When a specific trial emerges that may be relevant to your form of mitochondrial disease, it's usually it begins with a conversation with your doctor, right, about how good a candidate you are to participate in it. But that decision, that conversation alone does not determine whether or not you get into the trial. You move on to the next step if you're still interested in what's called screening. So now there are very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria that are established for any clinical trial. Inclusion, patients must have a genetic diagnosis of ... Must be between the ages of 18 and 35. Must be able to walk without assistance, right? So sort of very clear inclusion. And the same then for very clear exclusion. Previous history of kidney disease. I'm making these things up, right? So it can be any number of things that either say you must have them be in or you must not have these criteria in order to be excluded from the clinical trial. So that's what takes place in a screening process. So if you move through screening and everything looks like it still fits, the most important step then, and this comes down to ethics, and it's really important, is discussion of informed consent. And if you leave with anything else today, I really want to emphasize this. Quite often you'll go to a doctor or you'll be part of a clinical trial. You get through this stage, and now there's this kind of big document sitting in front of you that describes everything that's going to be done, right, in the clinical trial. And every attempt is made to write those in a way that is understandable for a lay population, not a clinician, not some kind of expert in the field. But quite often, it can be really hard, right, to pull this apart. Every patient has the right to ask questions, understand everything, right, that's inside the protocol. The protocol describes how the trial is going to be run before they sign and basically say, I'm consenting, right? I understand the risks associated with this. I understand what's going to be done. I still want to be a part of it. So informed consent is really important part of this. That's good ethics. And so as the patient, putting on my patient hat right now, this is where ask questions, right? Understand, make sure you know what the commitment's going to be associated with it, and that you're comfortable and familiar with how the trial is going to proceed. So that's the informed consent stage. Once you've signed and you're into the trial, now you get randomized. Imagine there's 10 of us. 5 are going to get randomly picked to be over in the therapeutic arm. 5 are going to be picked to be over in the control arm, the placebo arm, and the trial begins. And like I said, most trials ensure that everybody eventually gets access to the drug, potentially even after the trial ends, and so-called expanded access. But this is when the trial now begins. And as the trial begins, there'll be a schedule of visits, and each of those visits will have very specific either questions or outcome measures. They'll have you walk 6 minutes and measure how far you can walk in 6 minutes as one example, or your grip strength, how strong is your grip. These are the data that are collected in a very rigorous way, because that's taking place most likely across multiple sites across the country. So you got to make sure that you're collecting data in a consistent way that can be aggregated, combined, and then all the data judged for effectiveness. So that's the monitoring stage, right? While you're going through it. And then the trial ends, and there's usually some discussion that takes place between the doctors, the sponsor, whether or not they might be able to continue to have access to it, or what comes next. So that's the end of the study. And that closes the study. That literally puts a lock around the data. That's it at that point. And now it goes to a contract research organization, and their responsibility is to take the lock off, look at the data, report back to the company. And this is really important too. The company itself doesn't do that, right? You could imagine that might be, oh yeah, it looks good. No, not at all. They have to hire almost like an objective third party to look at the data and inform the company, these are the results, right, that you can move forward with in taking to the FDA. Okay, so let's just kind of wrap here on the next slide with why participate in clinical research, because I think that's really the main idea of this. There are very clear benefits associated with being involved in clinical research. First and foremost, as a patient, you will not receive better medical care than when you are participating in a clinical trial, because there will be a very set schedule that is most likely more frequent interaction with experts. than you would get in just your normal medical care. If you're not located close to let's say a mitochondrial disease center where there's a deep knowledge of mitochondrial disease, this clinical trial will be there, and you will be seen by real experts in the space on a regular schedule and closely monitored. Because if you recall, as I described all these phases, your condition, the safety of the drug, everything is being evaluated on a set schedule during that time. So there definitely a very real benefit to getting closer, more informed clinical care while in a clinical trial. And then there's the more, less tangible, but I believe also important of just knowing that you are contributing to advancing the development of treatments and cures for mitochondrial disease. And participating in a clinical trial is often referred to as a very selfless act. You may benefit from it. You'll have to sign off on this in the consent form. There's no guarantee that you will benefit from it, but I can assure you, whatever the outcome, positive or negative, that data, that knowledge gain is advancing the development of treatments and cures. And this is the more the emotional plea to be involved in clinical research, that if you're willing and comfortable with the way the trial's designed, to take that selfless step of being involved in clinical research, knowing that it may not be for you that it ultimately benefits, but someone else with mitochondrial disease will. But it's only fair to say, Margaret, maybe one more click, there are also potential risks, right? There's some uncertainty of a novel drug, right? I talked about how you do all the work before you get it in humans. We think we understand it. It gets into humans, it doesn't behave the way we expect. So there's some uncertainty, or maybe it causes side effects that couldn't be predicted inside the preclinical research. So there are some potential risks associated with it, and the protocol, the informed consent, is required to list, here are some of the risks that we anticipate you may face if you participate in the clinical research. But in conclusion, ultimately, this is very much a personal decision, right? And the best way to make that personal decision is, one, be informed. So this kind of educational, just sort of understanding the overall process, at least at a high level. But when you're starting to talk about specific opportunities, do it in partnership with your healthcare provider or healthcare provider team, where there may be multiple people involved, so that they can help you work through any questions you may have, but also here's what you can expect, right, to come from it, and understand the benefits and the risks associated with it. So it's a very personal decision. It would not be fair for me or anyone to come onto a meeting like this and say, you must participate in clinical trials. That's not fair. It's a very personal decision. What I am sharing with you, though, is absent an engaged patient community, we won't get to those. If the number one reason that drugs fail, I should have mentioned this in one of the previous slides, because the 14%, the number one reason, not enough patients, right? Not an ability to recruit the number of patients necessary to actually conduct the trial. That part's in our control, right? But it's a very personal decision. And lastly, Margaret, as I put down here, just know UMDF is here to support you on this journey. We can help to fill in some of the gaps, answer your questions. Ultimately, though, the most important conversation is between you and your healthcare team as to whether or not to participate in a specific clinical trial. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.